It's really incredible how frictionless buying things has become for you and me. Like if you need a new phone charger, you just pull out your phone, tap a button that says buy now, and 12 hours later it's sitting on your porch. It just feels like magic.
Right, yeah. But the reality is we've really just hidden the friction. We take all that incredible complexity of a global transaction, and we just bury it under a very friendly user interface.
Exactly. But what happens when you aren't just buying one phone charger? Like what happens when you're a global manufacturer and you need to buy, say, 5 million highly specialized microchips from suppliers that are scattered all over the world? Suddenly there's no buy now button for that.
No, definitely not. When you're buying for a massive global supply chain, you step into this really high-stakes arena. Getting sourcing right at that level, it's about far more than just finding the lowest price tag. It requires aligning every single external partnership with your organization's core strategy and, managing immense risk from that very first handshake all the way to the final invoice.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before a massive organization can buy anything, they have to figure out exactly who they're buying from and what it will, actually cost. And reading through our sources for today's deep dive, it becomes pretty obvious that figuring out the actual cost means looking way, way past the sticker price.
Oh, absolutely. In supply chain management, we view this through the lens of cost of goods sold, or COGS, versus total cost of ownership, which is TCO. So lowering your cost of goods sold is a massive lever for any business. Every single dollar you decrease in COGS is a direct dollar-for-dollar increase in your gross profit margin.
Right, which is huge.
It is incredibly powerful, which is why procurement teams are heavily incentivized to find cheaper materials.
Which feels completely intuitive. You find the cheapest supplier, you make more money.
Right.
But the sources warn that if you only look at the unit price and the shipping, what's known as the landed cost, you're basically walking into a trap, right?
Yes, a massive trap. You have to evaluate suppliers using total cost of ownership, TCO, which calculates the entire life cycle costs of doing business with them, not just the purchase price.
There was this brilliant example in the sources about copper tubing that I think perfectly illustrates this trap. So imagine a manufacturing company, and they're analyzing suppliers for copper tubing. They get quotes from Brazil, Korea, China, and the USA.
Right.
And looking strictly at the landed cost, so that's the raw price of the tubing plus the freight to get it to the factory. China won easily.
Yeah.
On paper, it was the absolute cheapest option.
But they didn't go with the supplier in China.
No, they didn't. They actually went with the supplier in the USA who, had a higher initial price. The deciding factor was geography. The USA supplier was only 3 hours away from their manufacturing plant.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese supplier had this massive lead time because, obviously, the tubing had to cross an ocean.
Right. And a long lead time means you have to hold a ton of extra inventory just in case there are, delays at the port or storms at sea or whatever.
Yeah.
And those inventory carrying costs, meaning the cost of warehousing, the extra tubing, insuring it, and just the sheer amount of capital tied up in it completely wiped out the theoretical savings from the cheaper purchase price. The shorter lead time from the U.S. supplier drastically reduced those holding costs.
So the local one won out.
Yeah. When you calculate the total cost of ownership, the local, seemingly more expensive supplier was actually the lowest cost option.
It's a lot like buying a really cheap used car.
Mm.
Like the sticker price on the windshield is incredibly low, and you feel like you got a great deal. But once you factor in the frequent breakdowns, the expensive replacement parts, the cost of taking a taxi to work when it just dies in your driveway, that cheap car ends up draining your bank account way more than a reliable, slightly more expensive vehicle would have.
That's a perfect analogy. And a world-class supplier actively helps you reduce those hidden lifecycle costs. They do it by adding value beyond just the physical product. We're talking about value-added services here.
Like what?
Well, a top-tier supplier might manage the inventory directly at your site, so you don't even have to staff a warehouse. Or they might break down bulk shipments into usable batches. Or even, embed their own engineers with your team to collaborate on product design.
That's fascinating. Let me push back on something here, though.
Yeah.
We read a lot about corporate social responsibility, or CSR, in these sourcing evaluations, evaluating a supplier's environmental sustainability, their ethical employment practices, customer safety records. If driving down costs, even TCO, is the main metric a procurement officer is judged on, does a company actually care about CSR? Or is that just, corporate window dressing for the annual report?
It's actually deeply tied to the bottom line, largely because of risk management. Look, an organization that owns a brand is held entirely responsible by the public for the actions of its extended supply chain. Think about the massive scandals we've seen where lead was found in children's toys, or food contamination outbreaks that got tracked back to a single negligent farm.
Right, the public doesn't care that the supplier made the mistake. They blame the brand whose logo is on the box.
Exactly. And the resulting damage to the brand's reputation, the legal liabilities, the plummeted stock price, the lost sales, those consequences completely dwarf whatever pennies the company saved by using a non-compliant, unethical supplier. A stringent CSR policy is essentially a shield that protects the company's long-term profitability.
Wow, okay. That really reframes the whole concept for me. So once you run this gauntlet of TCO and CSR and you find your ideal world-class supplier, you still have to actually get them to agree to work with you. You have to negotiate the deal.
Yeah, and how you negotiate depends heavily on what you are trying to buy. If an organization is sourcing standard commodities, things that are easily defined, standardized, widely available from dozens of vendors, they usually just rely on competitive bidding.
Like sending out an RFQ.
Yes, a request for quotation. The buyer sends out an RFQ and basically lets the suppliers fight it out to offer the best terms.
But if you're sourcing complex strategic materials or bottleneck items where there are only a few suppliers in the world capable of making what you need, you can't just blast out an RFQ, right? You have to sit down for direct negotiation.
Right. And negotiation at this scale is a delicate dance. You want a favorable deal, but you cannot afford to destroy the partnership before the ink is even dry.
The sources highlight this method called principled negotiation, developed by the Harvard Negotiation Project. It's this win-win approach designed specifically to preserve relationships while reaching solid agreements. And it's structured around 4 key steps. Let's walk through those because I feel like they apply to almost any conflict.
Sure.
So step 1 is separate the people from the problem. I interpret this as, not making the negotiation a test of egos. Like if a supplier is late on deliveries, you don't attack their character, you attack the logistical bottleneck causing the delay.
Spot on. And step 2 is focus on interests, not positions. And this is where most novice negotiators fail. Think of a position as the rigid surface-level demand someone makes. Like, I demand a 10% price cut.
Right.
But an interest is the underlying motivation behind that demand. I need to improve my cash flow this quarter.
Because if you only argue over the 10% position, someone has to lose. It just becomes a battle of wills. But if you dig into the underlying interest, the need for cash flow, you unlock new solutions. It makes me think of 2 roommates fighting over who cleans the kitchen.
Okay, how so?
Well, arguing over who cleans is a lose-lose battle of positions. But an interest-based negotiation is sitting down and realizing one roommate absolutely hates doing the dishes because it grosses them out, and the other roommate is terrified of taking out the trash in the dark alley.
Right, so once you understand those underlying interests, you move to step 3, which is invent options for mutual gain. In your analogy, the roommates trade chores. In a supply chain, if the supplier needs cash flow, the buyer might agree to change the payment terms so the supplier gets paid in 15 days instead of 60.
Oh, nice.
The supplier gets their cash flow, and the buyer doesn't have to take a hit on their profit margins. Both sides win.
And the final step is insist on objective criteria. Instead of just yelling numbers at each other, you base the agreement on independent standards, like market rates, inflation indexes, industry benchmarks to figure out what's fair, taking the emotion out of the pricing.
Which naturally leads into the concept of triangle talk. It's a practical framework for entering these discussions. It involves 3 points. First, know exactly what you want, separating your strict needs from your nice-to-have wants.
Right.
Second, know exactly what the other side wants, which obviously requires active, empathetic listening. And third, propose a solution they can actually accept based on the overlap.
The final and arguably most crucial piece of preparation our sources emphasize is knowing your best alternative.
Yes, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or BAT&A. Before a procurement team even sits down at the table, they must know exactly what their organization will do if this negotiation completely fails and the supplier walks away. Will they manufacture the part in-house, go to a slightly more expensive backup supplier?
Because if you know your walkaway plan, you have leverage. You aren't desperate. Okay, so we've evaluated the costs, we've navigated the interests, we found our mutual gain. Everyone is smiling. But in the world of global supply chains, good intentions and a friendly handshake are not enough. we have to move into contracts.
We do. We have to codify those intentions into legally binding rules of engagement to mitigate some massive financial risks. The type of contract chosen fundamentally dictates which party holds the financial risk.
Let's look at the three main structures. First, you have cost-based contracts, where the buyer agrees to pay the supplier's actual costs of production plus a fee. This puts the risk of cost overruns squarely on the buyer. Like if raw materials spike, the buyer foots the bill.
Right. And then you have firm fixed-price contracts, where the buyer agrees to pay a set amount no matter what happens. In this scenario, the supplier absorbs all the risk. If their costs suddenly double, they still have to deliver at the agreed-upon price, and they just eat the loss.
Ouch. And finally, you have incentive contracts, which are designed to foster long-term partnerships. I found the psychology behind incentive contracts really fascinating. They share the cost savings.
Exactly.
If the supplier finds a more efficient way to manufacture the goods and brings the cost down, both companies get a cut of the extra profit. It motivates the supplier to continuously improve rather than just resting on their laurels. But a contract of this magnitude is about way more than just the price tag. The terms and conditions are where the real armor is built.
Right. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you'll find clauses detailing Incoterms. These are international standards defining exactly when the responsibility, the cost of freight, and the liability for the goods transfers from the seller to the buyer. Like, if a cargo ship sinks halfway across the Pacific, the Incoterms determine whose insurance pays for it.
You also have strict conflict resolution channels defined. And our sources pointed out how critical language and translation rules are in these international documents. Like a single poorly translated word regarding a technical spec or an undefined term regarding currency exchange can quite literally wipe out an entire year's worth of profit margin for a company.
Which brings us to the mechanics of getting paid. Because moving millions of dollars across international borders between companies that operate in entirely different legal systems gets very complicated very quickly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Our sources broke down the mechanics of a letter of credit. When I was reading this, it struck me as being basically like using an escrow service when you're buying a house.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, because neither the buyer nor the seller fully trust each other yet. The buyer doesn't want to send the money until they know the goods have actually shipped. And the seller doesn't want to ship the goods until they know they'll get paid. So they use their respective banks as these heavily armed, highly regulated referees.
Yeah, a letter of credit, or LC, brilliantly neutralizes that counterparty risk. The process starts when the buyer goes to their bank. The buyer's bank issues the LC, which is a legally binding promise stating, we have the funds and we guarantee payment upon proof of shipment.
Okay.
The seller's bank is notified of this guarantee. Now the seller feels completely safe, so they load the multi-million-dollar cargo onto the outbound ship.
And here is the crucial piece of paper. The shipping company gives the seller a document called a bill of lading. It serves as a receipt, but more importantly, it is essentially the physical title of ownership for the cargo.
Right, so the seller takes that bill of lading to their bank. The two banks communicate, they verify the documents, and once the buyer's bank receives the bill of lading, they release the funds to the seller.
The payment is made, the buyer's bank hands the bill of lading to the buyer so they can claim the goods at the port, and everyone goes home happy. It is this beautifully choreographed dance of paper and money.
But there's a hidden factor here regarding international payments, and that is currency exchange risk. Think about it. If a US-based buyer signs a contract agreeing to pay €1 million in 6 months, and the value of the euro shoots up against the dollar during that time,
suddenly that contract costs the U.S. buyer significantly more dollars than they budgeted for.
Exactly. A shift of just a few percentage points in the exchange rate could obliterate the profit margin on the entire project.
So how do they stop that?
To prevent this catastrophe, companies use currency hedging. They purchase financial products, like futures contracts, that lock in a specific exchange rate for a specific date in the future. It costs a fee to set up the hedge, but it buys absolute stability and predictability for the accounting department.
Okay, so we have our bulletproof contract, our shipping terms, our hedged currency. But a signed master agreement is really just a theoretical document sitting in a drawer until you actually start buying things. Section 4 of our deep dive focuses on contract management and purchase orders. How do organizations translate these massive agreements into daily operational execution?
Well, the transition from signing to operating is called deployment, and it is an ongoing function. The buyer must monitor the relationship to ensure the supplier is living up to the deal. Organizations rely on SLAs, or service level agreements, to track highly specific metrics like what percentage of deliveries are arriving on time, what's the defect rate, what is the volume of customer complaints.
And the sources drive home a vital philosophy here. You can outsource the work, but you cannot outsource the accountability. If your supplier cuts corners and makes a faulty product, you still maintain ultimate responsibility to your end customer.
Right. And when it comes to the practical execution of ordering, the mechanism is the purchase order. Now, a discrete PO is a legally binding contract for a single one-time transaction. It spells out the exact terms, quantities, prices for that specific delivery.
But if an organization is buying from the same supplier every single week, issuing a new discrete PO from scratch every time becomes a massive administrative nightmare, doesn't it?
It does, which is why the solution is a blanket purchase order. It's a long-term commitment that establishes all the master terms, conditions, and pricing for an extended period, say a full year. Then, when the factory actually needs the materials, they just send a simple order release against that blanket PO. It vastly reduces the administrative paperwork and speeds up the entire procurement cycle.
But whether it's a discrete PO or a release against a blanket PO, the accounts payable department won't just cut a check because someone asked them to. They require a mechanism called a three-way match.
Right, to prevent fraud, embezzlement, or even just simple billing errors.
Exactly. 3 separate records must perfectly align. First, the original purchase order showing what was requested. Second, the receiving report that proved the dock workers actually counted the physical boxes that arrived. And third, the supplier's invoice demanding payment.
And if those 3 documents match, the system approves the payment. If there is a discrepancy, say the invoice bills for 100 units, but the receiving report only shows 90 arrived, everything grinds to a halt until the error is investigated and resolved.
Discrepancies cause delays. And delays lead us to a fascinating and often contentious part of supply chain operations. Expediting?
Oh, yes.
Expediting means rushing an order, pushing it ahead of the queue, begging the supplier or the freight carrier to move faster. Now, I have to push back on the literature here. It treats expediting like a disease. But wait, if I'm a buyer and my manufacturing line is about to shut down or I have a VIP client screaming for a product, speed is good, I want my supplier to drop everything and expedite my order. Why is that bad? Well, from the perspective of a single panicked buyer, expediting seems like a necessary lifeline. But zooming out to the macro level, expediting is almost always a symptom of systemic failure, usually poor demand forecasting or bad inventory planning. Think about the mechanics from the supplier's side. Factory floors are scheduled down to the minute to maximize efficiency. If they stop the line to rush your VIP order, they have to delay someone else's order.
Oh, I see. Which means tomorrow, that other company's going to call up screaming for an expedite.
Yes. It triggers a cascading domino effect of chaos. It introduces massive inefficiencies into the manufacturing process. It incurs exorbitant rush fees. It requires overnight air freight instead of cheaper sea freight. But the most insidious damage is actually behavioral.
How so?
If you allow expediting to become routine, you train everyone in your system to ignore normal lead times. Sales reps stop planning ahead because they know they can just scream loud enough at procurement and get their orders expedited. It destroys the discipline of the entire system.
Wow. Managing rogue sales reps, demanding expedites, manually verifying 3-way matches for thousands of invoices, tracking SLAs. Doing this at a global scale seems impossible for human beings to manage by hand. The sheer volume of paperwork would bury a company.
It would. And the breaking point of manual work leads directly into our final section, e-procurement. To achieve scale, modern supply chains rely on digital marketplaces and automated software to execute everything we've just discussed at lightning speed.
Right. And the foundation of e-procurement involves portals. Like you and I use consumer portals like Amazon to aggregate info and buy things. But B2B supply chains use business portals, specifically supplier relationship management or SRM portals. These are highly customized digital dashboards.
Yeah, an SRM portal allows a supplier to log into the buyer system and see real-time point-of-sale data and actual factory inventory levels. The supplier knows exactly what they need to produce and ship before the buyer even has to generate a formal order release. It creates a seamless flow of information.
Beyond individual portals, the industry uses trading exchanges, which are essentially massive B2B marketplaces where buyers and sellers meet virtually. You have horizontal exchanges, which offer generic supplies across multiple different industries, like an exchange just for buying office furniture or cleaning supplies. Then you have vertical exchanges, which are deeply tailored to the specialized needs of a single industry, like aerospace or pharmaceuticals.
Right. And the ownership models of these exchanges dictate how they operate. A private trading exchange, or PTX, is hosted by a single dominant company to exert control over its own massive network of suppliers. An independent public trade exchange, an ITX, is a neutral platform open to anyone who wants to buy or sell.
So sources gave a fascinating historical example of the third model, a consortia trade exchange, or CTX. Back in the year 2000, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, three massive, fierce competitors, actually teamed up to form a consortia exchange called Covasint.
The rationale behind Covasint was brilliant. The automotive supply base is incredibly complex with tens of thousands of suppliers. Before Covasint, every automaker had their own proprietary software and communication standards. Suppliers were tearing their hair out trying to manage different digital formats for Ford, GM, and Chrysler.
The automakers realized that the software platform itself wasn't their competitive advantage. Building cars was. By cooperating and consolidating their auto industry supplier base into one shared, standardized digital marketplace, they all drastically lowered their friction and transaction costs.
These powerful exchanges also allow for highly efficient digital auctions. Instead of spending months locked in direct negotiations, a buyer can set up an auction in hours. There's the classic, or forward auction, where sellers post items and buyers bid the price up. There's the Dutch auction, where the seller starts with a high price and drops it incrementally until a buyer finally bites.
There are also demand management auctions, which act as digital clearinghouses for companies to sell off excess supply or obsolete inventory. But the mechanism that has the biggest impact on sourcing strategy is the reverse auction.
Yes. In a reverse auction, the dynamic flips. The buyer posts the exact specifications of what they need to purchase. Then, pre-approved suppliers log in and submit lower and lower bids, undercutting each other to win the buyer's business. The buyer's identity is usually hidden, creating a highly competitive pressure cooker environment.
It forces the price down to the absolute floor. But wait, that seems risky. If a supplier gets caught up in the heat of the auction and competes purely on price, couldn't they win the bid but commit to an entirely unprofitable margin?
What's fascinating here is that is exactly the hidden danger of reverse auctions. It can easily become a race to the bottom. If a supplier wins the contract but loses money on every single unit they produce, they will start cutting corners on quality to survive. Eventually, they might go bankrupt.
And if your critical supplier goes out of business, your factory shuts down.
Precisely. The buyer must remain vigilant about the long-term health of their supply base, even when the software makes it so easy to squeeze them for pennies.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started by looking past the sticker price to evaluate the true total cost of ownership and the risk mitigation value of corporate social responsibility. We walked through how to untangle conflict using interest-based negotiation, how to lock in those intentions with binding contracts, and the exact mechanics of using banks and letters of credit to safely move money across borders. We discussed the daily grind of purchase orders, the systemic dangers of expediting, and finally, how e-procurement and digital exchanges automate the entire massive ecosystem.
It highlights how deeply interconnected the modern world truly is. We've seen how e-procurement digitized the manual purchase order. But as algorithms get smarter, we are approaching an era where AI doesn't just process the transaction, it actively conducts the principled negotiations and executes reverse auctions in milliseconds without human intervention. If an AI negotiates a complex international contract with another AI, who is ultimately responsible when the supply chain breaks down?
Wow. That is a heavy, entirely new layer of risk for organizations to grapple with. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. The next time you tap that Buy Now button and a package magically appears on your porch, I hope you take a moment to appreciate the incredibly complex, finely tuned global machine that made it happen. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time to unpack another complex topic on the Deep Dive.